Hello, welcome to a special edition of This World coming to you from London. The coronation is over. King Charles III has been crowned and is in Buckingham Palace. Now, for quite some time here in Britain, attention is going to shift to politics, to the House of Parliament behind me, because a lot has been happening on that front. We've been seeing the Conservative Party here in Britain continuing to lose support. The Labour Party seems to be gathering support, but other parties as well. We had council elections just a short while back. The Conservatives got completely and totally trashed. They dropped something like 1,000 seats. Labour picked up some seats, but so did the Liberal Democrats, so did the Greens. So what does this mean for the politics of Britain? What does this mean for the general elections that are coming up in a year's time? What does it mean for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak? We're going to be telling you that in the course of this program. We'll be joined by special guests who will be taking us through the politics of the UK and what lies ahead. Also, the entire question of Brexit. It's now been something like 3 years since formal Brexit. What does Britain feel about it? Is there some regret? Is there a feeling that perhaps it was the wrong thing to do and we should be part of the EU after all? Maybe too late right now, but we're going to be taking a look at that question. And finally, we're going to turn our attention to Scotland, where increasingly there has been a rising popular mood for the possibility of another referendum. The entire question of Scottish independence been linked to some extent in some people's mind with Brexit. But is a referendum even possible? We will turn our attention to that subject as well. But let's start off by taking a look at politics. Where do the Conservatives stand? Where does Labour stand? Who is likely to win the next election? Here's our special analysis.
Who is likely to win the next elections in the United Kingdom? Before we answer that for you, let's look at when the next election is due. No later than 28th of January 2025. That's according to the rule book. The one is that UK will go to the polls in late 2024. Running for office will be the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and maybe an independent candidate or two. But the race will be mainly between the Labour and the Conservative. The Conservatives are currently in power. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will be leading them to the polls. Will he be able to deliver a positive result? Recently, Britain held local elections. The Conservatives lost about 1,000 council seats. It's a worrying sign in the lead up to the elections. The Labour Party was quick to brand it as a clear rejection of Rishi Sunak. Labour leader Keir Starmer declared that his party was on course to win the next general election. But it is not that simple. Both parties have their plus and minuses. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, for example, is facing a unique problem. Voters are not able to relate to him or his helicopter rides as they struggle to make their ends meet amid the cost of living crisis. Then there is Rishi Sunak's wife, Akshata Murthy's business interest. The Sunak government has been accused of favouring a business that Murthy is invested in. Sunak is now being investigated for potential conflict of interest. The state of Britain's economy isn't favouring the Conservatives either. Inflation is at a 4-decade high. While it may not be of the Conservatives' making, it will be them paying the price for it.
From Westminster to the British people.
What about the Labour Party? Is everything really working in their favour? The Conservatives have been in government for 13 years. So the anti-incumbency will be working in favour of the Labour Party. There are analysts who believe that while Labour Party could be the largest party in the next parliament, they may not have the kind of numbers the party would like. According to one estimate, if elections were to be held now, Labour Party would get 44% of the vote and Conservatives would get 28%. Electoral calculus suggests that Labour would get anywhere between 294 and 417 seats in the 650-member House. A YouGov poll suggested that 31% of UK adults believe that Keir Starmer is doing a good job as a Labour leader. 49% say he is doing badly. What about Rishi Sunak? 51% of the public, according to YouGov, believe Sunak is doing badly as Prime Minister. 31% think he's doing well. When Sunak was asked what he feels would happen in the coming polls, he said, and I'm quoting him, "I'm not detecting any massive group swell of movement towards the Labour Party."
Well, joining us now to tell us exactly who's going to win the election in 2024 and by how many seats, Nigel Fletcher, from political historian at the King's College here in London. Thank you so much, Nigel, for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
You do know exactly, right? Who's winning the election?
Well, one thing I know from political history is that you should never make predictions. And I think even if it looks now as though we can predict the number of seats at the next general election, I think you'd be a fool to put money on it at this point. Things can change, and one of the things that...
But the Conservatives seem to be doing badly. I mean, that is fair to say, right? That for the moment they look as if they are on their way out.
I think that's fair to say, but on the other hand, William Hague, one of the former leaders of the Conservative Party, wrote an article this week in which he said that local elections are not always the best guide to a general election. When he was leader of the Conservatives, they were doing very badly indeed, and did do very badly at the general election in 2001. But a year before that, they did pretty well at the local elections. So I think you have to be a bit careful about it, but I think certainly it's not looking great for the Conservatives at the moment.
What are the main problems? Why are people unhappy? Is it because of the cost of living crisis? Is it because of the economy? Well, what underlines this?
Well, I think there's a number of things going on. As you say, the cost of living crisis is a huge thing. We've seen levels of inflation that most people in this country will not remember having seen.
It's what, 19%, right?
We're looking at sort of periods of the year when we've seen huge figures like that, and that's not something people have been used to. So you're seeing prices going up in the shops, you're seeing people's mortgages costing more as well, with interest rates having gone up, and all sorts of things that are squeezing household incomes, and that doesn't do well for the government. But at the same time, you've also got a government that's been in office now for 13 years, and I think any government that's been in office for that length of time, they do degrade over time. Their popularity declines, and you have what political scientists call costs of governing, that people's attitude towards the government inevitably declines over that time. So you've got a number of things going on there, and of course, you know, you've got a Prime Minister who's been in office for a very short amount of time, but after a fairly turbulent period in British political history.
So, you know, when you're looking at that period, people say that, you know, the Conservatives actually hit rock bottom at that rather chaotic 49 days of Liz Truss.
Yes.
Has Rishi Sunak been able to pull it back or not enough? Or is he personally somewhat popular but not enough to help the Conservatives? How would you rate him?
Well, I think that he's stabilised the Conservative Party and the government for the period that he's been in office, but that's not really saying very much. As you say, the period both through Boris Johnson's latter months in office and then into Liz Truss's very brief premiership, it was a period of enormous turmoil which did huge damage to the Conservative brand. And we saw with the polls, they fell off a cliff during that period, and they haven't really recovered to the levels they were even in the last days of Boris Johnson. So it has been a very damaging period of time. And I think what we're seeing is that whatever people's view of Rishi Sunak as a person, the brand of the Conservative Party is what's really dragging him down.
So when you're looking at who's going to benefit from this, Conservatives took a real beating. And a horrible beating in the local elections. You're right; it's not necessarily an indicator for the general election, but it's a pointer as to the way things are going. So they took a real beating, but all the benefits didn't go to Labour. The Liberal Democrats picked up a lot of seats. The Greens did reasonably well. Yes. Is that something you think could happen in the general election? That it goes, maybe the Liberal Democrats come up more than people think they're going to?
Yes, I think that some Conservatives are hanging on to that as being sort of some false comfort that the Labour Party didn't benefit exclusively. I think anything that sees the Conservatives doing less well and other opposition parties doing well is bad for the government, it's bad for the Conservative Party. And I think what's a danger for them is if people start voting in a way where they pick whoever is going to defeat the Conservatives. That's what we've seen in previous elections, most notably in 1997 when the Conservatives went down to a huge landslide defeat. People were voting tactically. They were voting for Liberal Democrats if they were the main challengers. They were voting Labour if they were the main challengers. And I think that's a bit of what we're seeing in the local elections. So where there are other parties that are challenging in those seats, it's very bad for the Conservatives that people are seeing who the main challengers are and voting for them.
All right. Nigel Fletcher, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.
Well, the entire question of UK politics is bound to be linked to some extent with the entire question of Brexit. Now, many years have passed since Brexit, but I think the jury is out on whether it was successful or not. In fact, more people would now tell you that they felt it wasn't what they had hoped for. It wasn't successful after all. And why do I say that? Well, partly because of the economy. People had thought there were going to be economic benefits to Brexit. Certainly didn't happen. The British economy has not been doing too well. If anything, it's the worst performer among G20. So that didn't completely happen. Immigration hasn't completely stopped. So why was Brexit done? Why is Britain having to pay that £140 billion that many people feel has been the price tag, the annual price tag of Brexit? Well, here's our look at the entire Brexit question and how it could affect politics here in Great Britain.
Three years on, Brexit casts a long shadow on the UK. To begin with, an increasing number of people want a second referendum. From January 2020 to April 2023, an increasing number of people believe that Brexit was a wrong decision. This number stands at 53%, while 33% think this was the right decision. 14% are still struggling to figure out where they stand. As a matter of fact, Britain now has the slowest growth rate among G7 countries. As per IMF forecasts, this will further shrink. A close look at the trade sector brings with itself three alarming facts. 1. The UK economy is less open to trade after Brexit. The trade openness of UK, which is measured as the ratio of trade relative to gross domestic product, has fallen by 8 percentage points. 2. Export declarations that businesses have to fill have tripled, while import declarations have increased by 50%. 3. Post-Brexit investment levels of UK are over 30% lower than its usual rate. If we talk about cost of living, the post-Brexit era in the UK has made things way worse. It has added 6% to Britain's food bills. Brexit boosted Britain's average food bills by £210. That is $254. The job sector isn't suffering less. Millions of British jobs were linked to Europe. As a result of Brexit, jobs were put in dire straits. There are 330,000 fewer workers in the UK, meaning they are jobless. Sectors such as transport, hospitality, and retail have been particularly hard hit. Lack of workers has resulted in various kinds of shortages. It has disrupted supply chains. These in turn have pushed up bills for customers. As per reports, this downward turn is set to deepen in 2023. So, has Brexit fared any well for the UK? Or is regret already setting in?
And now to discuss the impact of Brexit and what it means for UK politics and what it might actually also mean for things like possible Scottish referendum, who better to talk to than Professor Tim Bale, who's Professor of Politics at the Queen Mary University here in London. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, it's been, 3 years since formal Brexit. Is there regret taking place?
Well, if you look at the opinion polls, there is. The number of people who say they would like to rejoin the European Union has actually increased significantly, and it would appear that some people who voted for Brexit in 2016 have indeed changed their minds, partly because they feel that the economic promises made about Brexit has just not been delivered.
Tell me, why do you think people voted for Brexit? I mean, I know it's a subject on which much scholarship has been done and reams of paper, but why did Britain take that decision? Because for people looking at it from outside, it seemed baffling even 3-4 years ago, 5 years ago, whenever the referendum took place.
Well, I mean, a large number of people have always felt that they weren't exactly part of the European Union, they weren't part of the European continent, they were an island nation. And there was an extent to which I think immigration played a part, people's concerns that too many people were coming from the European Union and the only way to stop that was to leave. And I also think that the country's economic growth since the financial crash of 2007-2008 has not been that great, and there were some areas of the country which basically felt left behind, and this was a way of, if you like, registering a protest vote and kicking the establishment, if you like.
Okay, protest vote and kicking the establishment, fine, it's happening in many countries around the world. All democracies seem to be trying to do that, or many of them do. But when it comes to the question of immigration, which many people did believe was a central part of it, that's still an issue, right? Maybe they're not coming in from Europe in the same number, but the entire row over small boats and the small boat policy is still linked to immigration.
Yes, and one of the ironies of Brexit is that in fact immigration has, if anything, increased recently. Certainly legal immigration, it's just not coming from the European Union. It's actually coming from South Asia, it's coming from Africa, both west and east. But the immigration coming from Europe is now, as you say, supposedly illegal immigration on small boats coming from France bearing asylum seekers. And in some ways what's happened is that the wider concern about immigration has begun to focus on these asylum seekers. And the government, I think, in part is responsible for that, because it feels by creating this message of stop the boats, it can actually hold in some of the voters that voted for Brexit and voted for the Conservative Party in 2019. So in some ways it's a double-edged sword for the government. It's a problem, but also it may mean that people continue to vote Conservative in order to do something about it.
So does that surprise you then, if there's a certain amount of regret about Brexit taking place, at the same time there's concerns about areas like immigration? Does it then surprise you that the Labour Party seems to be doing as well as it is? Because it's almost contradictory, right? Labour's often been seen as being more pro-immigration and issues like that?
Yeah, I mean, Labour's been very careful, I think, not to say too much about immigration. It wants to avoid that as an issue if it can. And it certainly isn't saying very much about Brexit either, because it realises that some of the voters it wants to get back still do feel quite strongly about those kind of sovereignty issues. But I think one of the reasons that Labour is doing so well at the moment is partly because Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, crashed the economy. And a lot of people are feeling very sore about that.
She wasn't Prime Minister for that long a period. You still think she crashed the economy in like a few short weeks was enough?
Believe it or not, it didn't take that long, just 49 days. Exactly, that mini budget, I think, did cause a lot of problems. It's in some ways impacted perhaps on people's mortgage rates, for example, because interest rates have had to go up in order to reassure the financial markets. And obviously we have a cost of living crisis here to which she didn't provide a solution, and of course nor did Boris Johnson. And then there are the complaints about the way that Boris Johnson ran number 10 Downing Street, Partygate, etc. So there are quite a few reasons why, even if the opposition isn't particularly inspiring or doing particularly well, the government is so unpopular that it's bound to redound in Labour's favour.
All right, how's Rishi Sunak himself doing? I mean, coming from India, we always have a certain interest in saying he is, of course, of Indian origin, so we always have some interest in whether he's doing a reasonable job of governing.
Well, one thing you can say about Rishi Sunak is he's more popular than his party. That's quite a low bar at the moment because the Conservative brand
is more popular than the Conservatives in general.
Yes, and I think the Conservative Party is hoping that there will be some kind of halo effect, that he will pull up their ratings. It doesn't look, given the recent local elections, as if that really has been the case. But I think, compared to someone like Liz Truss or indeed Boris Johnson, he is seen as more competent, more reliable and probably more ethical than they are. So, I think he's done the Conservatives some good, but whether he can do them enough good to make much difference to the next election, I think is another matter.
All right. Professor Tim Bale, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. And let's turn our attention now to Scotland, where a lot has been happening. We do have a person of Pakistani origin, Hamza Yusuf, now taking over as the First Minister there in Scotland. The Scottish Nationalist Party continues to be the largest party in Scotland, and they continue to say, we need another referendum. We need to reopen that entire question of Scottish independence. And yes, Brexit did have something to do with that, because remember, in Scotland, a lot of people didn't want to leave the European Union. The vast majority of people in Scotland did vote to say we would like to remain in the EU. Now, time has passed. Economically, things are not going that well. And that is why, once again in Scotland, there is talk about let's have another referendum and let's reopen the entire question of Scottish independence. Now remember, there was a referendum. And in that referendum, the people of Scotland said we would like to continue to be part of Great Britain. But that was before Brexit. Recent opinion polls say something somewhat different. If you were to have another referendum just right now, it is possible that the result could be different to what it was in the last referendum. But let's just turn our attention to this entire question. Could there actually be a referendum? Is Scottish independence something that could even be possible?
The story begins in the 9th century. That is when the independent Kingdom of Scotland was formed. Its neighbour was the Kingdom of England. The two remained independent of each other until the year 1603, when the two united and came under the same monarch. Cut to 1707, the parliaments of Britain and Scotland passed Acts of Union. The two became Great Britain. But social and cultural differences between the two remained, and this gave rise to demands for self-governance. Demands for going back to being independent. Two referendums were passed in the years 1979 and 1997. They led to the formation of the Parliament of Scotland. But this Parliament had limited powers. It could make laws on health, education, but decisions related to defence, foreign policy or economy were taken in London, which is why the demand of Scottish independence never really died. Cut to 2014, Scotland held another referendum. The question was simple: should Scotland be an independent country? 45% voted yes, but the majority, 55%, voted no. They voted for Scotland to stay in the UK. It's been almost a decade since, and a lot has changed in this time. But there's also been Brexit. Some think 62% of Scottish voters had voted against. And now they believe that Britain's final decision to exit from the EU was against Scottish interest. Brexit renewed Scotland's push for independence. It once again highlighted the fault lines in this union. But for a referendum to happen, Scotland would need London's nod. So far, it hasn't been able to secure that. In 2019, then Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon requested then British Prime Minister Boris Johnson for a referendum in 2020. Johnson said no. Why? He said that the 2014 referendum was intended to be a quote-unquote once-in-a-generation vote. Sturgeon sent another request for a referendum in 2022. Johnson again said no. The Supreme Court of the UK then said that Scotland cannot hold a referendum without the UK government's approval. Earlier this year, Hamza Yousaf became the new leader of Scotland. He belongs to Sturgeon's pro-independence party, the SNP, or the Scottish National Party. Soon after coming to power, Yousaf sought British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's permission for a second referendum. Sunak was quick to say no. The question is, for how long will the UK be able to continue saying no? Today, Scotland wants different things than the UK. It believes in free university education, inclusion of the LGBTQ community. Scotland wants a more open immigration policy. It wants green policies. Analysts say Scottish independence is no longer a question of if, it is a question of when.
And that's it on this episode of This World, coming to you from London in the United Kingdom. We'll be back to the studios next week, so do continue to watch us as we bring you the top stories from around the world and special analysis on what they mean for you.